Yes, people. Welcome to another workshop with Rye Wax. My name is Tony Nwachukwu from Create Define Release at CDR, and we're here this week with the wonderful Moving Steel. Give it up.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me, CDR and Rye Wax and the Arts Council. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thanks, Tony, for being here and hosting.
Thank you so much.
Realm, because a lot of my stuff was very 808 based, 909, all real live instruments, but I never used a lot of sampling, and I really wanted to get into it. So that kind of what drove it. I can show you the sample.
Yes, please.
Okay. So this is the sample that I used. So this is a Saidi mizmar, which is the name of the instrument, which is really common in North Egypt. And it comes from not a famous song at all, and there was something about this that really resonated with me. And at the time I was super inspired by Apron Records, Stephen Julian's record label, and I was listening to that a lot, and I was like, what if you had Apron Records going to Egypt and made a sound like that? So in my head I was thinking Apron Records at the pyramids in Cairo, through the city, going through the markets, and that was kind of the foundation of that song. And then kind of the other thing was that, as I was saying to you, I really loved 808s and 909s, and I strictly only used those drum machines. But there was always something missing, that there was this lack of live feel, a real drummer's perspective. And then what I started to do is use breaks, chopping those breaks, and using the airy part of those said kicks and snares that really can then combine with those 808s to really just bring kind of a live instrumentation. So it makes it sound like there's actually a real drummer there rather than, a straight up 808, which can sometimes be, when you use it in all your songs, it's very obvious, so I was trying to change that.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one thing I did, listening to your music, there is particularly the later stuff, there's definitely a kind of distinctive sound. It sounds, like you said, like a live drum. All the drums are recorded in the mid-80s, do you know what I mean?
Exactly,
or if you used a drum machine like a 707 rather than using an 808 or 909. Maybe
exactly,
use 8 or 909 for the low end, but in terms of the mid-range and
absolutely,
highs,
absolutely.
it's all about 707-ish style acoustic sound.
Exactly, yeah. So you're kind of bringing, combining this kind of electronic drum kit with more of a live kit, and making what you think is the best sounding drum kit. And that was kind of the basis of the whole song, was based on, that sample, the drum kit, and then just loads of reverb. Just loads of it. But yeah, that's
can we look at the drums then, maybe? Yes, let's start this.
So for the kick, I had basically 4 different kicks together, each of them playing at different sections of the song. So if we just go into here, and maybe I'll just loop this section here, we'll just have a listen to here. So what you have is basically 3 kicks playing together. In this one here, you have kind of more of a high range kick, and then something which is, and then kind of something that is basically just getting a bit of the air of this kick, and then finally then you have in this section here, which is this, is your 808 kick, which I basically tailored down, and there's no high range, there's just the sub, absolutely. And then so that was pretty much kind of, I was swapping these out at different sections of the song. So this, for example, this second one here gets played at a different section of the song, and then combining them so every section has a combo of those 3 kicks. And that was kind of how I drove that part of it. But then if we go into, just say, the kind of other parts of the drums, which I had a snare and a bit of reverb here. And, I'm a huge fan of snares in terms of getting its mid and really popping that out in a mix. I just think it sounds really, really distinctive, and it just reminds me a lot about rock music. So, you can really hear that snare. So that's what I did with that. A bit of reverb, small bit of EQ, and then a compressor. And then also had some lovely hats, and I also love putting a bit of a boost on the super high ends, because I just think it just gives it a
sheen,
bit of sharpness and gives it a bit of brightness as well. You know, I think, you know, the more you kind of cut down in the brightness, it can give a certain mood, and I wanted this to feel like, you know, disco meets techno. So, and then I also had a second snare that played from this drum break, which I'll show you what that drum break sounds like by itself. So standard break, and I just basically chopped that in a sampler and picked the parts that I liked about it. So it just means that it gives you the illusion that there is a bit of shuffle already, because you're chopping it in certain sections, and different snares will have different volumes. So it just gives you this lovely illusion. And then next up then is my sample, which we've heard just here. And what I did was I actually went into the sample and pulled it differently to the way the original structure was. So I kind of
warp, you know,
absolutely
warping is magic.
So I warped it, and my biggest advice for people who are trying to warp is definitely use this guy. If you have Ableton, go into Complex Pro, and that really, especially if it's something that's really slow, it can just make really cool artifacts and actually make it sound that it's not like a glitchy clip, basically. So yeah, so basically I got that clip, I rearranged it so it sounded a bit different. I also transposed it and then saved it so it didn't sound like the original until we could get clearance for that sample, which I'm very thankful that we have. So what I did was with that is I went into that sample. Oh, sorry. And I have lots of things happening here. So I have basically a delay that's then panned right and left only on one channel, so that means it gives you a bit of space.
Yeah, before you do that, you've got a audio, you've split the signal flow, right? So
yes.
Yeah, maybe go for each one. Maybe.
Yeah, so what I did was I split the channels into the audio into two channels, so within that same audio channel. So it's one that's driving all the way to the right, and then one that's driving all the way to the left. If you put a small bit of delay and have it at that one at the right channel at 13 milliseconds, it creates it to be a bit wider. Yeah. And if you combine that then with reverb, then it gets super wide. Yeah. So let's just see what it sounds like without the so I'm going to move this to a more.
So the original sample was mono, was it?
It was kind of, it was recorded. It was stereo, but it was just not great. Narrow, yeah, it was quite narrow. Yeah. And now, I don't know if that's coming through. So you can hear that now. And I have some side chain, and I have a pretty heavy decay time on the reverb. It's it's nearly 40%. And basically then, if I have this off without the wideness, it's just, it doesn't spread as much, and it just allows it to give this kind of oomph that you need to separate and add these other elements on top of it. So yeah, and then I just have a basic compressor. You don't need to use this, you know, the Ableton compressors are quite good. And then I just have a side chain to the kick to make it kind of sound pumpy, yeah, exactly. So without it, it sounds pretty basic, and then it just gives a bit of rhythm.
And you rolled off quite a lot of the bottom end there from the act.
Absolutely, because I know that my main target here is to fit bass and also my pads, and this is just really kind of maybe warping the entire track, so it's kind of nearly kind of giving it a big hug. Yeah, that was the main idea there. So yeah, that's kind of how I went about that sample, and I actually had so much fun with this because I'd never used the sample in this way, and adding the reverb just really kind of gave it just like a bit of life, you know, compared to what it sounds like if, you know, when you listen to the original sample, which is here. You know, it just gives it this more spacey feel. So,
and the sidechain obviously gives it this kind of a life of its own in terms of
absolutely.
The pumping effect gives it this kind of melodic, rhythmic component, which will really help drive the track.
Yes, exactly. And then obviously this is where the Apron Records comes in. I always love the kind of lush pads and keys that Apron Records put out. It's just it was the type of sound that I was listening to at the time, and I was like, I wonder if I could do the same. So I'm just going to listen to it without adding some of these effects here, just to. So it's just a really lush pad, and putting that on top of with the sample, it just really sounds really good together. So what I did at the start of it, I just EQ'd it, cut out most of the low end because it's not needed. Most of the main notes are kind of around mid-range there. And then I also put a frequency shifter, which then gave it a bit of movement, small bit of movement. So then I'm, changing the amount, the rate, and also the spin on it as well, and it gives it this sound. It's just
like a phaser, very phasing.
And it's also detuned ever so slightly. If you go too much, it can sound really rubbish. So it's I wanted to just add this kind of nearly as if you're using a pitch bend, but ever so slightly. And then a bit of reverb, and then also to create a bit more movements, then I added an auto filter that was moving with an LFO very slightly as well. And then just because there's a lot of stuff happening, I put another EQ to cut out anything that was not great, because there was a couple of frequencies that kind of started to really saturate when I added these together. So I just cut them out, and then finally a compressor. So I always tell people, look, whatever you do effects-wise, effects, EQ, compressor. That's just the best equation. You can add more if you like, but that's the best rule of thumb is, effects, EQ, compressor, or you can even do EQ, effects, EQ, compressor. Yeah, sure. So it just depends on what you're trying to do.
Ultimately, whatever you do in the middle, right? The compressor is the thing that kind of tames and controls the.
Exactly, it just glues it together, And I always think that that's like mixing is kind of one of those things where there's no really rules, but there is basic equations that you want to follow, and then you can kind of do what you want as long as it's getting the sound that you want. Yeah. Like if things go into the red, as long as it's purposeful and you want to distort it, there's a purpose for it, but just to make sure you're kind of cutting out the things that are going to be harsh and annoying in the ear. Mm-hmm. I always think that the best tip I've heard from my old teacher, Martin Clancy, is if it's something that you're hearing and it's overpowering the mix, it's annoying, get rid of it. That's just, and it's funny because if you keep hearing this one thing, if you keep hearing this one pattern or one kind of saturated note, it means it's too loud and get rid of it.
Yes, good tip.
So then for the bass, which is honestly what really drove home this song, so as I mentioned to you earlier, is that the drums in this, they're all straight, they're very quantized. The only thing that's really given it swing is the fact that it's from a break, so there's probably a small bit of swing there, but the main swing is coming from my bass because it's not quantized at all. So if I just zoom into...
Absolutely.
So...
How did you come up with the patch sound?
For the bass?
Yeah.
A lot of messing while on tramadol. Okay. So I don't know how I did it, but I called it Al Disco Haram, basically, because I just didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah.
But just to give you an idea of what that sounds like by itself, so I basically put in an arpeggiator.
Yeah.
I have it on up, and it's straight, and then I have the rate at 16, 1/16, and the gate being at 66. Mm-hmm. And I also have made that into two channels, a low version of it and a top version of it. Okay. The low version really is just to keep it mono, keep it in the 200 hertz and not really do much with it. And then your top, which is going from 200 all the way to the end, that you can add reverb or saturate and have fun and automate, which means that your main sub of that bass is always going to remain the same. And it's also going to be a mono, especially for pressing records. Yeah. So it means that the needle's not going to skip if it does get pressed. And also then you can be really fun and put your top part of the bass in stereo without actually affecting your mono side of it. Yeah. So what I have here is the arpeggiator with its rate and the gate. And then I have obviously the weird synth that I created, all in Ableton. And then I have a saturator that I drove it at 8 dB, which is a lot. So if you hear it by itself, it kind of sounds a bit odd by itself. And it's also not in time at all. So you can see here that all the notes are really not in time.
So is that a combination of arpeggiation and note values?
Yes.
Yes.
So it means that when I actually, if I click here, for example, I have my laptop, I can play those keys. So let me go.
Cool.
So I'm not pressing them on time at all, but because of the arpeggiator, it kind of puts it just a bit on time, but not perfectly on time, which means you can play with that until you find a pattern that probably works. So I've probably done this for hours, literally hours, because I was like so off my head on tramadol that I probably didn't realize how long I was spending, and I eventually found one loop that I was like, that sounds absolutely incredible with my drum pattern, which sounds like this. Okay, so then on top of that, when you add your second bass, which is the top range, you have your reverb, you're saturating it, it gives you this number. So without the low end, this is what it sounds like. And it means I can really automate this and just pull it across throughout the entire track, add in saturation.
Yeah. Is that the same MIDI information for the both tracks, or are they separate?
Exactly the same.
Sure.
Exactly the same.
So
I just
you
copied
used
them.
it, yeah, got you. Yeah.
They're identical basically, and the only thing that's different is that I'm changing the frequency and resonance for the top range, also automating the saturation, and also adding more gate in the arpeggiator, and it just allows the notes to kind of mingle together while the mono is still stable.
Yeah, Lynch.
And it just means that you don't have to have too many issues in the sub ends, and it's really stable, and you're really just making it move and shift. So I always say to people, your bass, think of it as you want to have fun with your bass, use that for the top end, low end to keep it stable, because it just really gives that oomph in the low end, but also being really playful with the top end.
Yeah, great tip.
And then last but not least is I obviously loved this sample, and I was like, I wonder if I can just sample the sample and put it into a lead. So I took this part here, and that's it. Sounds absolutely rubbish. Small snippet, and then I put it into a sampler.
Good old simpler or something.
Sorry, yeah, simpler.
Yeah.
And I think I just added a bit of glide onto it. Yeah, I did. And I detuned it as well, just to get it in key. And then I EQ'd it, ping pong delay, and a compressor. And again, this is not a stock plugin, but it was the one I liked because it had a bit of noise that I really liked with that lead line.
Which plugin is that?
It is. It's part of the Waves plugins.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So it says
it's CLA 76, yeah.
And
it's just that it just has a lovely background noise that it just sounds nice, sounds like a tape delay, and I really just like that sound because it just reminds me of how the disco songs were recorded. So it's kind of bridging this kind of between techno and disco, and then having this fully Arabic inspired right in the middle of it. And that's why, like, Al Disco Haram, and Haram means, forbidden in Arabic culture. So it was kind of like, we don't care about the disco, we're more into the techno, but it was kind of like a mix of the two of them together. So then for that lead, what that sounds like here is, sorry, by itself. Now, you have to remember, I was sitting in my bed, so you're hearing some microtonal scales there and a pitch bend. And somebody asked me, how did you do that when you're in bed? You don't have a pitch bend on your computer. If you go into the sample, you can actually automate the pitch bend too. There you go. So I knew that at these notes, this is probably where I'd need to bend it. And you can kind of automate that if you need to and you don't have a keyboard. So the idea of this whole project is you actually don't need all this hardware. I have hardware and I love playing with hardware, but it's also really nice that you can just make something like this completely in the box.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also, I guess that there's a of course, writing with pitch bend in real time has a value. Of course, it does.
Yeah.
But in equally, doing it after the fact, as the way you've done it by necessity, that also gives you a bit more control. I guess.
It does.
Yeah,
It does. Like, there's always something nice about doing it live because you're going to get some artifacts that you might not be able to do that's drawn in. But given that the situation I was in, I definitely couldn't get out of bed, and I was able to do it. And to be honest, I didn't know that this existed. So I was just like, how do I automate this? Well, okay. So I just thought it was really fun, and then it means that when I go into a live context, really the two things that I always pick as a live instrument is my lead, because I love playing that live, because it's always going to sound different. So let's just, if we mute this for a second. Okay, so I'm just going to play this in a separate lead that's not from that sampler.
That's a nice sound.
So you can kind of do that in a live context, and you can just do what you want with it. So I think it's always good, because then people don't want to hear the same song that you've released in a live context. They want to hear some variation of it, and you can be really creative and adding new elements while you're playing live.
Absolutely.
And then, kind of last but not least, I just had some, because at the time I was trying to figure out how to bridge each section together, and the things that I was really into is having these like crazy, ambient kind of droney type sounds that just sounded really good together. So there's nothing like too crazy, except for I just have reverb on it to have a tail once it gets into the section. So we'll just go into what it sounds like here. So it really bridges different sections together. And if you go out here, just say, and then last. So
texturizes essentially.
It does, and then what I love about being able to pull this is originally these samples are probably tiny, and I just stretch them so much because it creates really cool artifacts when it's in beats mode, and you can kind of really pull them, and it starts to make this really grainy type sound. And then when you put that with a reverb, it really does bring lovely artifacts. The only thing is that if you're ever going to do that, just to be careful that you make sure that you EQ it, because sometimes it can bring in some
really raspy
stuff.
Yes,
yeah. So that's pretty much the kind of the basics of how I went about this song.
It's amazing. So talk us through how you arranging. So the technique that you use for arranging this track.
Absolutely.
And then of course the mixing side of things, which feels to me that you mixed as you went on, particularly because you've got a lot of control within each track. Right, particularly, so I assume the mixing process was quite straightforward.
Yeah, so for this one, I definitely, I usually kind of separate my mixing stage from my creative stage, but in this track, I done it all together. I was just doing it as I go. I always think of mixing like a canvas. Whatever you put something, you need to create space for something else. So it's just subtraction and addition, whatever you need to, or masking even. So what I do is, you can only kind of do it by eye, but you can also do it by ear, and then in combination together they sound great, that you kind of need to go, oh, maybe I need to bring this down a bit. But in terms of the arrangements, I was aiming for the DJs for sure. So I had a 1 minute intro, which is basically, bringing in really light drums in the first, say, bar here, which is up the top, which I'll just play it for like a second here. And the reason why is that I don't want to bring in the full kick yet. I kind of want to just give people a chance to, mix in, so that means when DJs are playing it, that they have a bit of leg room that they can blend in another song. So I was really aiming that I really want this played out in a club. That was the idea. And also in the state that I was in, it sounded amazing. So, and then I obviously changed that pattern of the drums in the next bar, which had more of a sub, an 808, which is coming in a bit better there. And I was slowly but surely fading. So the samples kind of played consistently at the start, but then the pads only start to kind of creep up slowly but surely into the mix. And you can start to really hear it in this part here. And then I kind of always know that from tracks that I love, that really it all kicks in around the minute. So obviously it depends on the BPM of the song, but most of the time it's in and around the minute time. And that's when I brought in my bass and got rid of the pad, and then I just had my sample then chopped that it wasn't playing consistently, so it sounded like this by itself. And then you get a tail with the reverb, and then it plays the second part of it, tail again. So it just means that your memory from a mixing point of view is you've already heard that full sample, so your brain is going to fill in the gap when it's playing during the song. And even when it's not playing, you just have this ingrained in your head. And that's the trick of mixing engineers. They make you have these illusions in your head, and then you fill in those gaps. And that's why you have this repetitive lead in your head. You just kind of start to think that those sounds exist even though they're probably not there. And then I had the bass as well in that area, and that's when I kicked them in, and I really started seeing some automation kind of coming in the top range. So you can see that I've just basically automated here with the gate. I've also automated the saturator, and at the same time the Disco Haram lead, bass, and I can kind of change the frequency and the resonance.
The automation side of things, were they done as additional layers once you had the arrangement in place, or as you went?
Very good question. I actually done the arrangement first, and then I wanted to create a bit more movement because it felt just very stiff. There was just nothing really happening, and I think the way to make more movement throughout that section, because you're essentially listening to a 32 bar section that just doesn't do anything. So in order to make it seem like there's something going on without too many elements being introduced, is automation and just adding some frequency and or cutting out frequency and adding some resonance, and then that really then makes that whole section feel like there's a lot of stuff happening, even though it just has drums, bass, a pad and a lead. And then I've pretty much done that. I kind of always change the location of my break in most of my songs. And for this one, I really just wanted your standard middle of the song break. It felt right. I know that some people do a lot of different things with their break, and I didn't want it to go on for too long. Now you hear music where there's like breaks that go on for much longer, and they are really impactful. But for this song, I really liked just having a really short one. That it's ready to go, and you can either mix out of it at that point, or you're just waiting for the next bar. But yeah, and then same thing again, same pattern again. But I think I had a second verse which is different to the rest of the song, just in this section here. And that's where I've changed the bass completely for just that section.
And the rides to kind of support it as well.
Exactly, yeah. So the drums, I think actually you're right that the drums, the rides only come in that section quite heavy, and I wanted to put emphasis on that because it's just post the break, just to kind of give it a bit of new life.
And I like the fact that you talked about this idea of the high frequency, the rolling off some of the high end of the hi-hats and that area. I like the fact that the ride sim is quite dull there, so it's got this kind of like almost like disco-y, tape saturated kind of sound and texture to it.
So where is it? It's here. So yeah, I actually didn't do a lot of it because actually the sound of that ride is already quite beautiful anyway, because it sounds like a real drum kit. And I think I just added a small bit of reverb on the full channel, and then on the reverb return, then I didn't even bother taking anything out because it just sounded good the way it was. And I think everything was then masked with it. So honestly, my EQing for this whole song is fairly basic. It was just like, bass should go here, take everything out that shouldn't be there. And then same with, pads, anything that was kind of peaking in the pad area, which is, it's at 194, it starts to be kind of where the main body of that pad is. And then again, kind of at 1K, and I just dip every part of every stem, I just dip. Now, there's a give and take of how much you want to take out in those elements, because you don't want to make it sound that it's losing its life. So I always can tell that if you can just bring your EQ to a certain point, and then at that point being like, I'm actually starting to lose the life of it. But most of these stems by themselves sound absolutely rubbish. So I think it's always like a message to people being like, don't listen to your stuff EQ wise by itself, because they're not going to sound good.
It's the sum of parts, right? Yeah.
It's the sum of the parts. Yeah. So all these things are going to sound absolutely crap by themselves. So you're going to be like, oh, maybe I should add a bit more. Just think of it as this as a whole. And if you really want to expand your knowledge of mixing, treat each section as an area to mix. So whatever wants to be the front of that mix, whether it's the lead, maybe the next section, actually your main prominent part is that the bass and the top notes of the bass being that prominent in that area. And then the same with the break. At the break, obviously there's no drums, so then I wanted to make the pad actually come out a bit and take up the lower range, because there was nothing else there, and that's kind of how I went through each element. I also was off my rocket, so it was kind of hard to know if what I was doing sounded great. Absolutely. But I made the mistake, well, I wouldn't say it's a mistake, I exported it, was quite happy, and I sent it to Nabiha Iqbal literally that evening. And I sent it to my mate, and he was like, did you do this in bed? And I'm like, yes, I did. And he's like, fair play, because you shouldn't be able to do this. And I said, well, it's too late now, because I've already sent it to Nabiha, and she started to play it pretty much everywhere from there.
So here's the thing. So obviously the track's been really successful for you, right? When you listen to it out loud, do you feel that, this might sound a bit weird, do you think it's you, as in, you know, you were obviously off your rocker when you were making the track, so there was this almost like a transcendental Jamal making the track, right? Do you know what I mean? So when you kind of, you know, 2 weeks later after you're off the meds, you know, were you still the same person? Are you still the same person?
Yeah, I think it opened my eyes because it made me realize that I didn't need to be so strict with everything, and I'm not having so many elements in the one place. And that was my problem, is that I was bunching everything together, having like a million leads and a million snares and a million, and it just like there was so much, and I was never really finishing projects correctly. So this is kind of, when I went and like revisited this project post making it, I was like, wow, this is kind of really enlightening. But the only thing is I had a really weird relationship with it because I listened to it for so long that I just was like, it's done, I don't even want to think about it anymore. And it took me a while, you know, I think it was maybe like 2 or 3 years after that song was released that I really started to get back into it and use it as a reference track. So anytime I feel like I'm really struggling trying to get something written, I'll open this project and just go, actually there's not a lot going on here. A song doesn't have to be a million stems or a million clips. Like even if you look at my basic stems, I had 2 variations of kicks, 2 variations of drums, 4 samples that I chopped, 3 pads, and then different variations of that same bass, and 3 variations of lead, and that was it. And then I just kind of used all those in that, because you see people's projects and they have like a million things and you're like, oh my god, why do I have all this stuff? You don't really need to do that. I think less is more. And I think this is like one of those projects that I always refer back to, and even sometimes I even bring that in to if I'm making a new track, I'll always have a reference to refer back, being like, you know, if I'm feeling kind of, you know, insecure or not confident about my mixing ability at that time, because you go through phases. Sometimes you're just like, today I just don't know if I'm mixing, I can't even hear properly. I'll just refer back to a song that I think sounds great, you know.
And it reassures you, yeah.
It does, and you will have that where your confidence sometimes will be shot down because you're just not having a good time. Or you might make a song that sounds rubbish at the time, and a month later you're like, actually that song sounds great. What was I thinking? It just shows you that your mental health is so important while making music.
Absolutely. I'm going to see if we've got any questions online. Give people... Yeah, that's all right. So while we're collating questions, I've got one more question. So, what's great about this track is that it's really fluid the way it came together, and as you said, there's something really what's the word I'm trying to look for? Not refreshing, but there's something really grounding about the fact that tracks can be fluid, you know, and you can build a track, you know, from a simple sample, build around it, have some really focused ideas, and create, you know, a fantastic track from simple elements, right? You know.
Absolutely, and I think that's the main thing that I always want everybody to feel, is that you can actually just be in that creative zone, really start to like pull stuff together from just very little elements. And I think this is kind of how I work generally. I work really, really incredibly fast, because when I started to learn music in a production sense, I was doing a PhD, so I didn't really have a lot of time. So I ended up being really quick at making a track. If you told me, can you make a track in 20 minutes, I probably could do it. And it was just because I didn't have a lot of time and I just needed to do it quickly. Even mixing, I just go with a gut feeling. If it sounds right at that time, I won't spend like weeks trying to EQ a certain part. It'll just sound good when it sounds good, and then I'll visit it and listen to it in 3 different ways, whether it's the laptop speakers or the phone or in a car. And once they sound good there, then my gut will tell me, being like, that's actually where it needs to be.
Amazing. So to conclude the mastering process, do you have anything on your master bus?
I do, and obviously, look, caveating this largely, I am not a mastering engineer. It's a whole dark art in itself, so my mastering is very, very basic, and it's more just to get it in the place that it needs to be for playing the club, but I do get all my stuff professionally mastered. So I just have an EQ, a bit of boost on the low end. I cut, you know, if there's anything that I feel that's, starting to spill over from the other channels, I kind of just dip a small bit here, and then I jump at 1K. This kind of changes every once in a while depending on the song, and I kind of boost here to where the best energy of the song is, and this kind of changes depending on the song and where the energy is the most. So I kind of, in and around that area, I kind of both boost, but then also then if I feel like I've cut too much high end, then I'll boost it a small bit there together, and it kind of ties it together. And then I have, this is basically just a tape deck. There's nothing special about it. It's purely for noise. It doesn't do anything except for just have that hissing sound.
And a bit of a bass bump, right? Just slight bass bump.
I actually
took, roll that out.
I didn't even actually spend too much time in this. It was basically just to give it that tape reel feel. And then I have the CLA76. You know, you don't have to use this. The Ableton compressors are just as good. I just like the sound of this one.
Cool. Any particular compression ratio, or is it again based on, you know?
I think it's track to track. Okay, for a mastering, you really want the lightest amount of. So I always put in, you know, super amount. The ratio being like quite low, nothing too compressed, because if you start to increase the ratio, you're really starting to squash it, and you don't want to squash it, because I like a bit of dynamic between. There's nothing more beautiful than seeing like a wave that has all your little peaks up and down, rather than having this fully squashed format. So I kind of keep it really. In terms of the ratio is quite low, and then also I have a really soft attack and soft release, and it just means that it's just about topping.
Yeah, just so it's like a blanket sort of thing. Yeah,
exactly, and it just kind of keeps it smooth throughout. Nothing too crazy, and then a limiter as well, which is very important. So that's really it. I don't know what the mastering engineers actually do. This is just my interpretation of what I think they do. So I think. It really gets my songs into the format to play. So most songs, before I get to a mastering engineer, I'm happy with this process that I'll play out.
Yeah, the pre-master, right?
The pre-master,
essentially, yeah. Because and also in a way, it's not really mastering; it's actually an additional element. There's obviously a control and a bit of compression, subtle compression, but ultimately it's about adding to this final sound of what you would like. Yeah.
And I know lots of people use different, you know, fab filters and stuff like that, and. Like, I'm not saying that you can't use that. It's brilliant that you can use that, but you don't have to. If your samples sound good and your drums sound good, you can really do very little to it, and it sounds good if you have good quality samples. So yeah, pretty much that's it. And then what I did was, towards the end, I think I took this compressor out, and the limiter, and kept this EQ in actually, and then exported it in the pre-master stage at -6 dB with this EQ on board. And it was because this is where I wanted it to be. That's how I wanted it to sound. I know some people are kind of debating whether, you know, you would include this or not. For me, that's what I included, and it sounded good at the time. But I think it depends on the song.
Absolutely, and the sound that you want as well. So,
yeah.
Cool.
Oh.
Yeah.
So
go for it. So the question was, when it comes to the compositional process, and you're working on sample-based music, would you work with the sample first, and then build a track around the sample, or would you build and jam the track first and then impart the sample on top of that?
So I think it depends on the sample. If it's a sample that is based in instrumentation, I definitely work with the sample first. And I make basically the most basic drums pattern possible: kick, snare, and I don't even care about what samples are even in the drums. It's just to get the rhythm, and then I'll focus on that at a later stage, but really just to get kind of the sample mixed in with whatever pad I'm going to use, and then the lead. So my real specialty there is to get the lead matching up with the sample, and then creating some patterns with the bass. That's kind of how I work, and drums are just left to the very end to try to drive it home together. Now, if the sample is a vocal sample, I actually don't even put that in until the song is finished. And then maybe at that time I'm thinking, God, this will be sick if I have a sample on top of this, as in like a vocal sample, and then I'll start to introduce that. And what's great is if the song is in a certain key, you can just detune the sample, whatever it is, into that song, and it usually sounds relatively okay in most case scenarios. It doesn't always work, but that's pretty much what I usually do. So I simple drum pattern, bass, sample, and then pads, and then lead. Pretty much that's the arrangement. And sometimes I don't actually use samples at all. So it just depends on the song. But yeah, more recently I kind of have stopped using a lot of samples because there's just so much thinking about the clearance. And
I wanted to actually talk about that actually. So can you talk us through the sample clearance process for this track?
So for this one, it was written by somebody that basically was not signed to a label. So I actually approached the individual himself, and it took a really long time because, you know, there was a language barrier there, and it was very complex trying to understand that it's like, I just want to pay the rights for this so I can use it for music. And eventually it worked. That's like the best case that can happen, is that it's just a mutual gentleman's agreement. There's no label involved. You're just paying off the person with a kind of a simple contract. Yep. And everybody's happy. He's happy he has money. I'm happy I have the sample. And then pretty much that's it. And, you know, it's just basically a payoff. But when it's owned to a label, there's a bit of a harder process where then you are kind of, if it's in a label, then there's, you know, an agreement where you kind of have to either split 50-50, or that there's, you know, whatever you sell, they're going to get a percentage, but also you're going to pay off a licensing fee as well on top of that. So it just depends. And I think, you know, as much as I love getting the samples, it's also a massive pain as well, because it just can be very laborious, and you might spend so much time and maybe not even get that sample clearance. So you could put all this work in and then never get that sample clearance. And that's why you're seeing a lot of Bandcamp now, that people are just putting out songs and edits for free, because it's just it's too risky to put it out. And, you know, you're kind of, the music industries have now changed from this whole bootleg vinyl and not going in that direction, because music is so accessible now. There's Spotify, there's YouTube, there's algorithms that are pulling these samples out. So people are kind of now drifting towards this, you know, if I make a banger edit, they just put it out for free because it's just too risky to get the sample clearance. So now even my new music, unless I know there's somebody that can definitely get that clearance, then I won't do that, unless I know in my mind that this is just going to be put out for free. So like, for example, I have an edit that I've been working on for months now, and I know I'm not going to get the clearance, so it's just going to be a freebie, because, and it's the only way, the loophole around it, you know, sadly.
Yeah, that's an interesting dilemma. You know, you would have thought that, anyway, that's a topic for another time.
And I think the main thing is, honestly, is for that, and so we can end that topic, is, for me, the main thing is, especially if it's an edit, is to give the credit for the artist who created that content. Even if you're putting it out for free, it just means that you're giving them the recognition they deserve in that light. And so even, you know, the worst case scenario, said label might tell you, can you please take this off, because they can't take it for your money because you haven't charged anybody. So that's, if you're going to do some edits, just be careful.
Absolutely. Any other questions?
Yeah. So obviously you can't always be in bed or travel. So the rest of the time, how do you manage your work life, music, family balance?
So this is
yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry.
So yes, drugs aside, how do you manage your work-life, family balance, you know, as you know, a human being in this music space?
So obviously I've been very privileged in a sense where I've learned how to write really quick music and operate very quickly. That, you know, I'm now a dad. I have a 2-year-old, and he's the best thing that's ever happened to me and my wife. And I have the best wife in the world too. I love her absolutely so much, and I think that the way it works is that, you know, I have my day job, I also have my music career, I also have my family, and I just fit them in when it feels right. It's just navigating of how long you're going to spend on that, and fitting it where it suits you as a family. So because I write very quickly, it means that I could write a song basically in 3 hours and just have it fully mixed and finished, and then that's all I need. And I'll tip away at that slowly. Now, I was very lucky before my son was born, is I knew he was coming, so I just...
You stacked them up?
I literally wrote like probably 40 songs.
Stack them up? Yeah.
6
Harvest!
6 of them went on Pam's Tracks' label, and then the rest of them I was like, pile. Baby's coming and he's getting older. So as in, like, Seth was already born at the time, but before that I was just writing, you know, edits, whatever came to mind. And now it's much slower, for sure. It's definitely much slower, and I'm trying to navigate that because it is complex. I'm not going to say it's easy, but I think there is a way that you just tip away. Don't, like, you know, you can make it work if it needs to work.
So do you apportion a regular amount of time a week, or, you know, how does it work?
That's a very good question. I think at the moment it's just more so that, you know, I'll just be like, look, I'm feeling a bit crap today. Today was a tough day, and I do it as a form of expression. I have no idea what I'm going to write. and it might lead me to writing an absolute banger, or it might just be like I'm pressing the same key for like 2 hours and nothing's come of it. So it just happens actually from stress. So when I'm stressed, I want to be on the laptop and I just want to, and I think it's because the pad sounds and all these leads, they just sound so nice and they just kind of tame me a bit. It's kind of like a form of meditation for me. So it just depends. I think I write my best music when I'm like super stressed.
Because it's therapy essentially, right?
Yeah.
And the other question I was going to ask, related to one's music life ecosystem. How do you then? What's your strategy to getting tracks out there and released? I mean, you've obviously been blessed with people reaching out to you, but if it's on the other side of it, with your shoe on the other foot, what.
So, as in like advice that I would give? Yeah. Okay. So when I first started out, obviously I emailed like every label under the sun, and I realized after a while that my emails were just absolutely terrible. I just had the same generic, hello, I have a demo, please listen, kind regards. And I realized after a while that no one was opening these emails because they were super generic. So I think that for anybody out there that wants to reach out to a label, firstly, think about whether that label suits the music you're making. And I always think, for me personally, I was writing music and then looking for a label that would fit rather than writing music for the label. Because I just think it means that it keeps your signature to yourself, and you're really bringing your kind of essence and signature to the table rather than you writing for the label. I'm not saying that doing the other way is wrong, but that was just my approach. So then approaching these labels, I started to be really kind of fun with the emails, having an amazing subject line, the banger you'll never forget, or your ears are going to be melted after hearing this song. And it does actually create a bit of conversation with people, because then they're like, there's a certain aspect of this that being like, I'm actually curious about this, because I actually, even when I receive emails from people, if they're just like, hey, I have a demo, please listen, sometimes you scroll past it, but you would open an email that has this like very fascinating subject line. You're like, oh, what's this? What's this song? So I always say to people, just be really creative with your emails, because people are more likely to open it. But don't. I think what I've learned over time is why people don't respond. It's just that like half these people are so busy, they have enough time to press the download button, and that's it. And it's not because they're like prejudiced, or they're just like trying to ignore you or ghost you. They just literally have zero time. And if they download your song, that's absolutely fantastic. So just keep an eye out for it.
So don't take it personally, basically, if you don't get a response.
Yeah,
cool.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So obviously talking about the emails that you send out to people, what did you put in the email to Laura Garnier, and what advice did you give to people cold calling legends?
What did I write?
So following on from the email question, so the email that you wrote to Laura Garnier, what was the content of that email?
I'm going to open it now.
Yeah.
So what's so funny, a pal of mine actually had emailed him, and I think he responded. So obviously I reached out to him saying, can I take that email? And honestly, like, the reason I got into music is actually him, because I seen him play in Block 2011 near Bristol in Minehead, and he blew the socks off the place. And literally I was like searching for this one song that he played as part of a live set. Doesn't exist. And it blew me away, and that was pretty much how I got into music. So let's remember what I said, because I can't remember. There's probably
it's before 2011,
so I'm probably just gonna like paraphrase it. Okay, so my subject line was, you inspired me in 2011. And then I just basically explained, that his set blew my mind, and that I have EPs, and I basically shared my entire discography. Well, not all of it, but most of it. And I kind of given him that I have more, if he likes it. Yeah. And he literally emailed me probably a couple of days afterwards, being like, "This is great, send me more." And I was like, "Holy crap, Lauren Garnier just emailed me." And I'm looking at my wife going, "Lauren Garnier just emailed me," and it was amazing, because how I knew was that he downloaded is that you can go on SoundCloud if you have an account, and you can see whether somebody's downloaded it. So I was quite curious. I kind of check it every once in a while, and I was like, he downloaded it. He fucking did it. So I was so excited because he is literally somebody that I've looked up to for such a long time, and to get someone of his caliber liking my music is like literally mind blowing. And even till today, he's just been really, really supportive. And every once in a while, I'll email him being like, "Oh, new track, if you like it or not." And he's just really good at responding, which is really difficult in the music industry to get a response from somebody. So it's not personal. If anybody doesn't respond to you, it's not that they're just ignoring you. They just literally doesn't have time.
Thank you for that response.
Thanks, Tony.
Yeah. All right, cool. So, thank you. This has been really insightful. So, what's next for Still Moving?
So next up, I actually have an edit that I played at Boiler Room. It's an Arabic Egyptian cover of "Be My Lover," and it really worked out so well at Boiler Room that people have been badgering me to get this out. And it's not like I've been slow. It's just been trying to get it sounding right, getting it mastered, and also then the guy who actually found the original of that song was kind of pushing me and encouraging me to try to make a different variation of it. So that will hopefully be out hopefully sometime in June. And then next after that, I'm kind of in the process of finishing an album. Hopefully will be a 24 track double
24.
24 hopefully.
Some of the Harvest on there.
It's just there's a lot of moving parts, and it's just trying to get it sounding right. And you know, I've approached the label and they're really, really into it. So now it's just really trying to get it finished. So it's in its skeleton stage now. I just need to put muscle on it.
Well, listen, Jamal, thank you so much for your time, man. Give it up virtual thank you to Jamal.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Cheers. Thanks, Tony.
And lastly, where can we find you on socials?
So you can find me on Instagram, Moving Zero Still, and you can find me on SoundCloud as well at Moving Still. And also, I have a Facebook, don't really use it. I have a Twitter, I don't use that either. But yeah, they're the two platforms, and you can also find me on Bandcamp as well, and Spotify.
Expect some, headline capting emails and DMs soon.
Well, look, subject lines are everything, really.
Yeah.
You can even use ChatGPT to make really cool subject lines if you need to.
Topic for another session. Cool. So yeah, just to give you guys a heads up, the next sessions. So next week we've got El Hardwick on accessibility. That's on the 30th. On the 31st we have a modular workshop with Elevator Sound, introduction to modular synthesis, and also on the 31st we have Yuande Adrenaline on community care. So yeah, check in this time next week. Thank you very much for your time. Say hi on socials, either to Moving Still or myself,
please
or
do.
to Rye Wax. Yeah, thank you. Until next time. Take care.
Cheers. Thank you, everybody.